Hello everyone, Reza here. In this video, I will show you the right way to get started with building business critical applications with the Power Platform. We will take a common scenario, an expense reporting solution. We will set up our own development environment, use solutions, Dataverse Tables, take help of Copilot, build our application, secure our data, and a lot more. So let's check this video out in action. Let's begin with exploring the right way to build business critical applications, leveraging the Power Platform. To build an app, we start with Power Apps. We begin with make.powerapps.com that lands us into an environment to begin with, and this environment is known as the default environment. Now, if you select the environment picker, this will list out all the environments that you have access to. A Power Platform environment is a space to store, manage, and share your organization's business data, apps, flows, bots, and more. The default environment is ideally best suited for personal productivity-based scenarios. Now let's take a scenario here of an expense reporting solution that I would like to build for my organization. I would like to build that in a specific environment. Now, the simplest way to get access to a Power Platform's environment is by leveraging the Power Apps developer plan, which allows us to explore the Power Platform at full potential for development or learning at no cost. And to create a developer environment, head over to settings and go to the admin center. Head over to environments in the admin center. This will only list the environments that you have access to. And in here, if you click new, you can give a name for your environment. I'll pick my region, and the type of the environment that I will select is developer. These are special environments intended only for use by the owner of the environment. The owner is the user who is creating this environment. I'll click next, and then I will click save, and this will begin the process of creating a development environment for the user. Once this environment is ready, if I go back to make.powerapps.com, the environment picker will now include my new development environment. And if I select it, it will swap the environment to my development environment. And observe right here, it clearly specifies that this is a developer environment and not meant for production use, which is ideal for me to build my solution first and then deploy it into a production type environment where I can go and share the applications with my end users. And whenever we speak about ALM, the first thing you should be thinking about is solutions. This is where I can start creating my solution and start adding components into it. Now, solutions are used to transport applications and components from one environment to another. So let's begin with creating a solution. I'll give my solution a name. I will call it expense reporting publisher. Now we've got default publisher options here, but as a best practice, I'll recommend going and creating a new publisher. Now, what's a publisher? The publisher of a solution where a component is created is considered the owner of that component. And with a solution publisher, we can also include a prefix which is a helpful mechanism to avoid naming conflicts. So here, I'll create a publisher with my initials, give it a prefix, and we can clearly see that any object that will get created in this solution will have this specific prefix associated with it. I'll click Save. So this will create the publisher. And now for my solution, I'll pick my publisher that I defined. I'll click Create. And this creates a solution. And in this solution is where I can start creating Canvas apps, model-driven apps, custom pages, automations, bots, security roles, tables in Dataverse, and a lot more. The best practice is to always create any component in a solution. However, typically, we end up creating things outside of solution context. For example, I go to make.powerapps.com and I say I want to create a Canvas app. Or I go to Power Automate and try creating a flow. If you've created things outside of solution context, we can bring it in solution context by going to Add Existing, selecting the type of app or automation that you've created, and then you can start bringing things into solution context. Now, one of the new features that we can take advantage of is solution by default. Now, if I go back to the admin center, my developer environment for which I am an admin of, if I select this environment, go to Settings, Product, Features, we have the ability here to create new apps and flows in solutions by default. So I'll go ahead and turn both these features on. We also have another new option called Preferred Solution. This allows the maker in that environment to decide which solution is your preferred solution. So any new objects that are created in that environment will land in that specific solution. So I've turned these settings on. I will click Save. Back to Power Apps. Now if I go to Solutions, I have an option here called Set Preferred Solution. And by default, the preferred solution is the Common Data Services default solution. So this I will now change to my expense reporting solution. I'll also check the option to show preferred solution on the solutions page. My preferred solution is defined as expense reporting. That means anything that I create outside of solution context in this environment will land in this specific solution. I'll go back to Home. In developer type environments, we also get the Copilot feature, which allows us to describe our app requirements in everyday words. That's right here on the home screen experience. If I was to start creating a table in Dataverse, here as well, I can simply describe my table by simply working with a Copilot that lights up. Now, why do I leverage Dataverse? Dataverse is a secure, scalable, intelligent platform for Microsoft Power Platform and Dynamics 365. From a security standpoint, authentication and authorization derived from Microsoft Entra ID. You can define role-based security. You can secure your data down to the column level. From a logic standpoint, you can define business rules, workflows, calculations, formulas. Dataverse comes with rich data types. You can create complex relational data structures. It's a scalable database. Plus, powerful integration capabilities, data importing, exporting, analytics, and the magic of application lifecycle management. So let's begin with Copilot to create our first table in Dataverse. I've described my intent here, which is I need an expenses app. I'll submit. So AI Copilot recommends a table for expenses with different types of columns. Here, I can work with the Copilot to change the schema of my table. I will interact with the Copilot to make some changes in my table. I've said change expense ID to expense title, which it has done. I've asked it to remove category, amount, and date. Next, I'll say add columns for start date and end date. You can see the different data types that are being assigned to the column. Expense title is of type text. Description is text area. And my date columns are of type date and time. So I've said create a choice column called expense status with values new, pending, approved, and rejected. And I can confirm that by viewing the type of the column, which is choice. And here are my 4 choices. Now at this point, I will go ahead and click create app. So what Copilot will do is it will create that table in Dataverse and create a fully responsive single screen canvas Power App experience that will allow me to interact with that table. Remember, the steps I've taken right now are outside of solution context. But because I have solution by default feature turned on and I set my preferred solution as expense reporting, if I explore my solution, you can see how the solution contains a table that got created through the process of me interacting with the Copilot. And this table gets that publisher prefix, which is RD underscore. And here is the Power App. It's connected to the expenses table. If I click edit, I can see my columns, my data. I also have Copilot here in the studio experience itself, so I can work with the Copilot to make further changes to my app. And if I preview my app here, it's a single screen, fully responsive canvas Power App experience that works on all device types and sizes. Here, I have a gallery on the left where I can select expenses that are created in that table. I can see the details. I can edit the expense details. Just change the description on this one, submit, and that change will immediately be reflected in my data source. I want to allow the user to add line items for a specific expense. Classic scenario where I need relational data. One expense can have many line items. So now comes the next step for me to create another table, which I can do directly in the Canvas Studio experience itself. You can go to data, click add data, and say, I want to create a new table. Now here, I can simply describe my table in everyday words and work with the Copilot once again to create a table. I even have the option to upload an Excel file. In this case, I'll create the table myself, so I'll say start with a blank table. I'll give my table a name. I'll call it line items. The primary column, I'll call it name. Description about the line item. You can see that I have various types of data to choose from. Here, I'll pick text area for description, date. I can even make fields as required in the data source. A line item needs to have a cost associated with it. I can pick the currency data type for this one, the category of the line item. This I can make it a column of type choice. So I can define my choices. For example, food, gas, and miscellaneous. I'll just save this one. And I will click close. This will go and create the table and connect it in my Power App. Solution view. Now to create the relationship between these two tables, if I simply select the line items table here, we have an option here relationship, many line items will be related to a single expense. I'll pick expenses. What's the name of that column? I would like to call that column related expense. And when I'm creating a relationship, I can also define which type of relationship I want to create. In this scenario, I'll create a parental type relationship, meaning if an expense is deleted, I would want the line items to be deleted. So that creates the relationship. If I go back to my line items table here, and if I go to columns here, I can add more columns. I would want the user to upload a receipt. I'll pick the type as file and an image. I need another screen for line items. I can simply say create a blank screen, start with data, pick line items, and just like that, I will get a second screen that I can rename to line item screen. And this screen provides full CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete in my line items table. So for example, if I click new, this is where I can create a new line item. Now that relationship that I created, which resulted in a lookup column in my line item table called related expense, I will add this. Now line items will be created for an expense. So in my home screen here, in this specific container here, I will go and insert a button. I will call this line items. And when the user selects this, I will simply navigate the user to my line item screen. So if I click, it takes me to the line item screen. Now in the header, where we have the text line items, I'll go ahead and concatenate some additional text for which expense I'm adding the line items. In my main screen, my expenses are listed out in a gallery that I have renamed to expenses gallery. So in my line item screen, in the header, I can use expenses gallery. That's the control on my home screen. Dot selected and dot. This exposes all the properties. One of them is expense title. I'm working on line items for expense 1. Now in this container, I would also like to add an option for the user to go back to the previous screen. On select of this icon, I'll simply use the formula back. So starting from the home screen, I can select expenses. This one is expense 1. If I click line items, I'm viewing line items for expense 1. If I pick expense 2 and go to line items, now I should be viewing line items for expense 2. Now the related expense lookup is where that relationship is maintained. This lookup column needs to have the value of expense 2 selected by default. So for this data card, which I will unlock, its default property I will set to my expenses gallery dot selected. If I was to pick expense 1 and land on this screen, now the related expense would be expense 1. And this data card is something that I can hide from the user's view. So let's create a line item. This is a food related expense. I'll put the cost, pick the category, pick the date, and optionally I can also upload a receipt. I've uploaded a receipt. I'll click submit, and this will go and create a line item. Now I've made quite a few updates to the app, so always best to save the app and go ahead and publish the app. Back to my Power App. If I pick a different expense on my home screen now, which is expense 2, and go to line items, it still shows me the expense for expense 1. The reason is because the gallery on the line item screen is connected to the entire line items table. So this I will change to my expenses gallery dot selected dot line items. So we can see there are no line items for expense 2, but if I go to expense 1, I can see the line items. If I create another one and save, that's another expense that gets added for expense 1. Whenever an expense is submitted by a user, it should begin an approval process. When an expense is created, it should be associated with a cost center. So here, I'll create a new table. I'll call it cost center. So I have name for my cost center. I'll add another column called approvers. I can define my cost centers, let's say Microsoft and Contoso. And I can define who my approvers are. So Reza is the approver for cost center Microsoft. For Contoso, it's going to be Sarah and Reza. Now from my expenses table, I would want to create a column. Again, I'm creating a relationship. I'll call this column related cost center. And I'll make this a lookup column that looks up to the cost center table. And if I go back to my Canvas app now, I will refresh my expenses table connection. For my expenses form on the home screen, I can go and add related cost center. And now, if I was to, let's say, edit an existing item here, I can also define a cost center. And the same solution is what I have gone ahead and built out further. So I'll go ahead and create a new expense. I can pick my cost center, click submit. My expense gets logged. The status is new. I need to submit it for approval. So if I go to line items, there are none. So I'll create one. So I'll create a food related expense. Once again, I can upload a receipt. I'll submit. I have the ability to submit it for approval. And when I submit, the status here will change to pending, and I'll get a notification that this expense request has been submitted for approval. Now, this is a Canvas Power App. We can also build a model-driven Power App. And in this scenario, I've built a very simple model-driven Power App. And all I've done here is just connected expenses and cost centers to the sitemap. The model-driven app is designed with admins in mind. I can see all the expenses, and I can also see the information in the cost center table. So if I want to add another cost center, I can easily go ahead and do that right here in the model-driven app. And in the Canvas app, if the user was to create a new expense, you can see that new cost center lights up right here. You can have a Canvas app and a model-driven app complementing each other. Now the expense that I created, the status is pending. I had picked Microsoft as the cost center, so Reza is the approver for that. In my solution itself, I also have a cloud flow. This flow triggers whenever a row in the expenses table is modified and the status of the expense changes to pending. Now, expense status is a choice column. So if I explore the choices for expense status, for pending, this is the specific value. And that's exactly what I've leveraged here. So my flow triggers when the status is pending. And once that happens, I go and get the details of the cost center because I need the approver information. And then I begin an approval process. I check the decision that the approver takes. If it's approved, I update the status of that specific expense to approved, else I set it to rejected. Reza, being the approver, receives an approval action. The approval action specifies the details of the expense request that has come in. There's also a link which, if the approver clicks, will deep link the user directly to that Canvas Power App and highlight that specific item under approval. Can go to line items as the approver, and the approver can directly take the approval decision in the email itself. I'll approve it, enter comments, and submit my response. Now, once that's done, the user who created the expense will receive a notification that the expense has been approved. Here's the name of the approver, here are the comments, and here's a link directly to that specific expense item, and I can see how the status has changed to approved. In Canvas apps, we also have a Copilot control. And for this control, all I have done is I have connected a data source, which is my expenses table. As a user, I can ask questions to Copilot about my expenses. For example, how many expenses are in pending status? And Copilot has context of the data. It understands the user context. It will respect security here. So it says there is one expense that is in pending status. Give me the total number of expenses, and so forth. So if I explore the solution, I have a Canvas app. I have a model-driven app as well. I have my approval workflow. My workflow uses the approvals connector, Dataverse connector, and an Outlook connector. So these are those connection references. Can also create environment variables. The sitemap for my model-driven app. I can also create security roles. So I have 3 security roles that I have created. The first one is expense user. On the expenses table, I have given it user level privileges, meaning the user can only work with their own records. So they can create an expense, they can read expenses only related to themselves, they can update that expense, they can delete, they can append this, meaning relate this to another table, or relate something to this table. Same setup for the line item table. And for the cost center table, they can only read all the data. That's the org level privilege that I have granted. I have an expense approval level security. On the expense table, notice I've given the approver read access on all the records. But for creating, updating, deleting, and all the other privileges, it's set to user level. Similar setup on the line item table. And for the role expense admin, they have full access on the expense table, and they have full access on the line items table. Now this solution I have created in a development environment. Next step, I will publish all the customizations that I have made. Remember, a developer type environment is predominantly meant for development purposes only. You get full access to Dataverse. You can create Canvas apps, model-driven apps, flows, leveraging premium features at no licensing cost. If I was to share these apps with my users to run them, they would need premium licenses. Now that I have my solution set up here, we also have pipelines in Power Platform, which is an in-product experience for application lifecycle management. I have a pipeline that I set up, which I have connected to this environment to allow my users to deploy this solution into downstream environments. I am currently in the development environment, and I would like to deploy this to my next stage that my pipeline administrator has defined, which is my test environment. So I'll go ahead and say deploy here. I'll click next. It's creating connections for me in that target environment. I'll click next. Here it's asking me to define the environment variable. I'll click next. It has the version of my solution, all the details about my solution. We also have AI generated deployment notes. I can click deploy, and this will begin the process of deploying the solution. The first thing that it will do is it will export the solution. You can see how the pipeline moves ahead, and now the deployment begins into my test environment. ALM. I can keep making modifications to my solution in my dev environment. That's where I have the unmanaged solution. And once I'm ready to deploy it for testing, I can keep pushing it to my test environment. Once I'm done with testing, I can click deploy to start my deployment to the production environment. It begins with establishing my connections. I can define my environment variable here. And once I click deploy, the deployment process will begin in my production environment. We have the solution successfully deployed to my production environment. If I head over to my production environment and go to solutions, under manage solutions, I will see my expense solution that got deployed via the pipeline experience. Now notice, you cannot edit objects within a managed solution. Now all I have to do here is start assigning security roles to my users and share my apps. I'll pick the expense reporting Canvas app. This I would want to share with the user Sarah. I would like to grant the expense user role, and I will click share. My model driven app, on the other hand, I would want to share this with my admins. So my app, the role that I've defined for this is expense admin. So Reza already has it, but let's say I want James also to get that role. I'll assign James the expense admin role and click share. So signed in as Reza as the administrator. Here is the expense reporting admin app. You can see that there are no expenses in the system. There is no cost center configured. So let me configure one and click save and close. Signing in as Sarah. Sarah receives an email that the expense reporting app has been shared with her, and she runs the app. This is the Power App in my production environment that is being run. Sarah can start creating an expense. The cost center is loading from my production environment Dataverse instance only. So I've added an expense. Status is new. Sarah needs to add line items. She adds one line item for this expense and clicks submit for approval. Status changes to pending. The expense request is submitted for approval. The approver is Reza. Reza has the admin role. So in the model driven app, when I look at expenses, even though Sarah created this, I can see all those details. I can also see the related line items that Sarah has submitted for that specific expense. And here is the expense approval email that comes out. Can approve or reject. Enter commands, submit the response. Sarah receives an email that her expense request has been approved. It's the name of the approver, the comments, and here's a link that directly takes Sarah to that specific expense item. Status approved. Here are the approval comments. If you enjoyed this video, then do like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And thank you so much for watching.